Hello, and welcome to ImpactoAZ, a podcast dedicated to centering Latinx voices on the important issues of our time. My name is Jonathan Higuera. I'm your host, and I'm here along with two co-hosts and our guests, our featured guests. So welcome Juan Rodriguez, our executive producer.
Hello.
Welcome David Lopez, our co-host and sometimes featured guest, a law professor from Arizona State University. And our featured guest today, Teresa Puente of Cal State Long Beach, a journalism professor there. Welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us. And this is a very heart-wrenching discussion we're going to have today. At least for me, it really tore at my heartstrings and just my sense of everything. It was very traumatic, and I'm glad we're all on here and we're all going to impart our views and our thoughts, and I'm sure some of our emotions might come out, and that's fine. We're here today to talk about the story that came about earlier this week, actually last week, on César Chávez and the scandal he was involved with of being an alleged sexual abuser and sexual predator, really, if you read the story close enough. And it is based on a New York Times investigation, a 5-year investigation into claims that he groomed and molested 2 minors, one of which led to a statutory rape allegation. And then other instances that also heart-wrenching of unwanted sexual encounters with Dolores Huerta, the other icon in this story. So I know when I first heard this news, it took me a couple of days to process it. I was in disbelief at the start, but once I went through the article and looked at it, it was a typical New York Times fashion, done very well, corroborated, done over a 5-year period. And it just showcased how these things happen and how people, through their use of coercion, tricks of that a predator might employ. I can't believe we're talking about César Chávez when I mention this, but to keep things secret. Let me start there. Let me think. Is there any reason, do you think, that we shouldn't believe any of these allegations? Not trying to cast aspersions on anybody's witness or testimony, but just start there. After looking at this story and the allegations, is there any reason we have to doubt this?
I'll start, Jonathan, and I'm sorry. As a woman, I don't think that's the right question to ask. I'm just going to say believe women. As a
Okay.
woman who has experienced sexual harassment, I'm so glad you invited me to this conversation, but I don't think that's where we should start the conversation. I think we should start the conversation with believe the women. The reporting is
Okay.
very detailed. Believe Dolores Huerta and the horrible experience that she was raped by Chavez. I believe her. I do say
And
that
I
I think
appreciate that.
there's more that may be revealed, whether that's what people in the organization knew and were complicit in covering, and whether there are more victims. I think that's the question we should be asking.
Okay. Well, I got to jump in there and say I did have a trepidation about starting with that, but I wanted to establish that these were well outlined allegations, well corroborated. So in my mind, after looking through it, there was no reason not to believe it. But the reporter in me, the journalist in me, always wants to know what happened, what did you know, and when did you know it? So that's kind of where that was coming from. But I think we're going to start from the premise, and I agree with you, Teresa, that this speaks truth to power. Of course, we'll never know César Chávez's side of the story for obvious reasons, but I think that's a valid point, and I'm glad you raised that issue like that. And I think that's a good point to move forward on this discussion. My fellow co-producer, any thoughts on
Yeah, no, John.
any
I
of
think
this?
it's so important to center. Yeah, Oh, go on, David.
No,
Hello?
absolutely. I think we need to center the women, center the victims here, and start from there. Someone who has been involved in many sexual harassment cases. I think that's where you must start as kind of a moral matter, and then sort of just you know remind ourselves of how much of their lives were lost because of this, and and use that as sort of our jumping off point.
Yes, absolutely. And despite my being stunned in the beginning of this and waiting to see more information and waiting to go through the New York Times story a little bit more exhaustively and looking at all the fine points that were raised, all the fine journalism that was done there, um, it went quickly from stunned, I won't say disbelief, but just stunned, wanting to sit with this, to now kind of, for me, tending to more trending towards anger when I read how this stuff occurred and how it occurred and the manner in which it occurred and the grooming that was involved and the betrayal of doing this to children of people who were some of his closest friends and top organizers. And then when you look at that investigation, it really paints a pattern, right? And that's the other thing you start to follow is the pattern. So um, I wasn't implying that I didn't believe any of it, but I just wanted to get a sense of whether someone thought we needed to investigate it further. Is this something that we do need to investigate further, or uh, do dead men tell no lies, or where do you think we should go from here?
Well, John, my take on it is this is not just a Cesar Chavez issue. I think it's a generational issue. I don't think what Cesar Chavez did was unique and isolated. Um, when I was much younger, I remember, and I think I was talking to you about this last week. I remember hearing within our community comments and rumors about Cesar Chavez's behavior. So when I heard about this, it wasn't new. It was just a lot of it was hearsay. A lot of it was, uh, whispers, but nothing definite, nothing as detailed what the New York Times did. But I would see on my campus, we would invite Latino leaders from his generation to come and speak to students. And I witnessed a lot of bad behavior by these men as the way they interacted with the young women on campus. Obviously the attendees, men and women the college students who attended these events were very much impressed. But at receptions and at parties afterwards, things could get a little uncomfortable for if you're in these situations. So I think it's a generational issue, and I think this should be explored further on that level. Years ago, I'm not going to say where this was, but I had a client who was already an elected official in her state, and she made the comment to me one time, you know, that surprised me. She goes, "You know what, Juan? You're very different from the men your age." And I go, "What do you mean?" Because, well, a lot of men your age talk down to women like me. I'm already elected official, and I get grown Latino men telling me, calling me mija, you know, uh, telling me when I make a comment that it's not good because there should be a man running in your district instead of you, things like that. So I think this misogyny and sexism and culture that's existed is not unique to in our community. It's not unique to what Cesar Chavez did.
That is, I recall back when Cesar Chavez died back in '93, I believe. Uh, I remember you attended his funeral, right? Wasn't it in Delano?
Yeah, I was at the time I was a reporter for the Press Telegram. Then it was a night part of the Night Rider chain in Long Beach, California, and I covered the funeral. Um, I'll
Right.
just say
Okay.
this, and that was uh, an incredible experience to be part of that gathering of people who marched for civil rights, for farm worker rights. So, and over the years, I interviewed Dolores Huerta many, many times. I found one of my earliest interviews with her was back in 1998 when I was at the Chicago Tribune. And so I went into the database to reread it and actually found interesting that she had said what she told me at the time in 98 was that she and Chavez would argue a lot over strategy. Actually, I think building on the misogyny that Juan just pointed out, she was a lot of the brains behind some of their best ideas. So, for example, she told me that Chavez wanted it to be a potato boycott, but it was her idea for it to be a grape boycott, and we all know that she coined si se puede as a phrase. But the misogyny is deep, and one of the things that really stood out for me, beyond the horrific details of his assault, rape of her, was how he spoke to her. Like the New York Times detailed audio recordings of meetings in which he called her a stupid bee. I won't say the word. I mean, that's just
Yeah.
utterly unacceptable. So I think just to build on what I said and what one said, like we need to look deeper at this culture of misogyny, not just then, but now. And that if there needs to be further reporting, it's like, how have we as a community, but a society at large, just not listening to the victims? I do want to pivot here a little bit too. Well, I'll say this. One thing that I am find some consolation is how most people in our community have reacted to this with belief and condemnation. Not all, there's some random people on Facebook blaming the victims, but the accountability. I really do believe that we should not have schools and libraries and all these things named after somebody who is a rapist. And so the ownership of that, unlike, you know, I don't want to, the Epstein files, and we have former presidents who were buddies with him, and up to 1,000 young women and girls were trafficked, and only 2 people went to jail for it: Epstein, who's now dead, and Maxwell. Who are the other men that abused those young girls? It doesn't matter if they're current presidents or former presidents. We need accountability. So I think that's what we have to look
Right.
forward. I'm proud that most of the people in our community have are asking for that accountability, but we need to ask for this accountability in our entire country.
Right. And isn't it ironic that um, some of the Epstein, our current president, is able to change the name of the Kennedy Center to reflect his name when his name is featured prominently in the Epstein files, although no charges have been filed or anything, but there's a lot of questions there surrounding his involvement in the Epstein affair.
Yeah.
And he's trying to get federal buildings renamed in his honor. It's kind of ironic. And
Well, we also
so
have
there was
countless
no time
young,
wasted.
yeah, but we also have countless women who've accused him of harassment and abuse, and he was convicted in one case of
That's
abuse.
right.
Um, Professor Lopez maybe can say more legally about that. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, I want to kind of build on both of what Teresa and Juan said. I mean, I think there is sort of a debate in my mind whether it is a generational issue, because it often feels like it's more of just sort of an ongoing power issue. And, we live in a world where the so-called manosphere, the sort of social media podcast domain that really kind of rests on misogyny, is extremely popular with young men, right? And it's sort of this ongoing infatuation with power. And, we see it in our community, but we always know that it exists. Like the issue of Epstein Island is really an issue of the absence of accountability for the super rich, regardless of who they are, right? That powerful men, that wealthy men live in a different level of accountability, and I think the grief of our community here is that many people like me grew up on on the picket lines, right? Grew up with Cesar Chavez on the wall, grew up with Cesar Chavez as an icon in the community, not only as an organizer, but as also as a spiritual figure in terms of like his fast and his integration of spiritual Catholicism into the movement. And again, I think it's just sort of a reminder that, like others, it's easy to become sort of infatuated with the powerful in a way that in many ways diminishes the rest of us, right? Diminishes what for Cesar Chavez was a collect. I mean, the United Farm Workers is the United Farm Workers. It's a collective movement by definition. It's a people's movement by definition. And whatever thirst that our community had for a Latino Martin Luther King or a Latino iconic figure that we can name streets after, or whatever, led many of us to forget that the power of that movement really resided in the people and resided in the people that came out, just like the civil rights movement. I remember during the debate over Martin Luther King Day holiday, there was someone who I thought was very persuasive who says, why don't we call it a civil rights service day? Because there were so many people that whose names we've forgotten who put their bodies on the line, right? For that movement. But it's sort of like this desire that I think you have to sort of embed against sort of this sort of system of racial idolatry that, both the African American communities and the Latino communities want someone that we can sort of revere because we've been fed, since an early age that you need to revere these sort of white men, right? George Washington never told a lie and whatever, right? Thomas Jefferson. And I think that what hopefully we can get out of this is sort of a reminder that both of these movements that are ongoing, right? It's important to center ourselves and that that the people are the ones that made the movement, right? I won't say I was in shock because I think Cesar Chavez had been his gloss had already come off in a lot of ways, right? I think not only in terms of the way that Dolores Huerta was sort of sidelined in the public retelling of the movement, but also Larry Idlong, right, who was a Filipino farm worker who was the other part of the United Farm Workers, right? And then really sort of his attitude towards undocumented people and his use of the W word. So a lot of the, in some respects, he was tarnished, not in a way that he is now. I mean, these are just sort of revolting allegations, but just again, a reminder, kind of a reminder that we're the ones that hold the power. And that movement was not just about one person. That movement was about everybody who walked, right? And everybody who was on strike and everybody who marched across the country and boycotted grapes, right? That's where the power was. And if we get anything out of this, hopefully it's sort of the reminder that, that's what the collective holds the power and not any one person.
And that reminds me that, speaking of being tarnished somewhat, in that book that came out in 2014 that Matt Garcia wrote, where they actually documented that he had 2 kids from 2 different women while he was married. And the book did not have anything related to his encounters with Dolores Huerta sexually. But some people criticize that book, saying, "Why are you writing this? Why are you tarnishing the movement in his name?" But that was
But to
kind
be
of
in that bind
a taste of.
is a reflection of racism that we have to ask that question. Like we can't hold our leaders accountable just because we're concerned about how it will look to the external world. Right. And I've seen a lot in the media. I really appreciate your comments, Teresa, about how our community really has come together for the most part in terms of demanding accountability. Really probably one of the most cherished leaders that we've had, right, in our lifetimes.
And speaking of accountability, is there any way for anyone to be held accountable? Obviously, he's not with us anymore, but do you foresee investigations, lawsuits? Is there any accountability now for these victims?
I don't know. I mean, I think what has happened in, countries that went through fascist dictatorships is there's a process of truth and reconciliation. And I think that, that's a question that those involved in the movement and our community needs to ask themselves because, clearly other people knew about this and there was a real effort to keep it. It's like Epstein Island. Like other people have known about it. Other people have, were sort of complicit and enable this type of conduct. And I think that those are the questions that need to ask, not in a way that lacks grace, but I think in a way that reminds us the next time we face these situations or what surely some people felt to be a moral dilemma that they act in a different way.
Yeah, and
And
as I said
California.
earlier, like we need more reporting on it to find out, what in the New York Times piece, one of the girls that he groomed put it on a Facebook page 10 years ago. So,
Yeah.
who saw that? Who read it? Did
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the foundation or the union, did they know about these allegations? Do people sit on them? I think these are
Yeah.
questions that if
Yeah.
we want true accountability, that we should there should be further reporting and investigation, whether it's done by the New York Times or the union itself. It
Yeah.
seems like from reading
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
story that one of the victims had at least tried to speak out more than a decade ago.
Yeah, and I
And
thought
she,
one of the victims had a letter that was available for public viewing in his archives at Wayne State, and that she had written the letter to him. And in context, the letter made more sense because
mhm.
it was sort of an expression. Yeah, it made more. It made.
She was only 13 when she wrote that letter
She
too.
was only
So,
13,
and the
right?
molestation had started when she was 12. So
Yeah,
it was there.
yeah,
You're right. You couldn't make context of it at the time, but now you could. And also the one, I think it's the same girl at the time was the one who posted on Facebook. And due to pressure, people telling her that was going to make the movement look bad, make Cesar Chavez's reputation look bad, she took it down. So, so there is pressure. There have been pressure on these folks, these victims, to keep it quiet. And no one did it better than Dolores Huerta, who kept her situation secret for what, 60 years, something like that. Uh,
yeah,
uh, and she didn't even let Cesar Chavez know that she was carrying his baby, wearing, according to the article, wearing baggy clothes and concealing all that. So there are some questions for me as a journalist hanging out there that make me wonder where to go with this and what to do with it. I know that California changed its sexual abuse laws or so that victims had longer times to file a lawsuit. There wasn't a statute. The statute of limitation wasn't removed completely, but it was lengthened. So I think there is still time that those kinds of things could happen, which could really put the UFW in some dire financial straits, right? If they were to file a large enough and win a large enough lawsuit financially. So there's a big can of worms that could be that have been opened here. Where
yeah.
that will lead, we don't know.
But I guess the question I'm interested in hearing, I guess, what you guys think is, what what can we take from this in terms of moving forward for the politics of our community at a time when our community is really under siege, right? We're in a period of sort of borderline ethnic cleansing and masked agents on the street, and so many of the issues from voting to immigration really center back on our community. And our community is fragmented in so many different ways, and we need to kind of think of what our politics look like, right? And what do we take from this, right? What kind of lessons do we take from this moving forward? Because there is no good time for something like this to come out, right? But I'm just wondering if there is a way that we sort of take it constructively, kind of maturely, in a way that, hey, wait a second, we're gonna lean into a more horizontal form of leadership, right? Where we all become leaders, where we all become like the pebbles in the pond that create ripples instead of looking for, the one person to lead, because that's what they believed in on paper. That's not what this story is about. The story is just the opposite. The story is about one man who abused his power in really reprehensible ways. And I think at the time the movement was a collective action, a collective activity, and they lost the spirit of it. And maybe it was just the insecurity of our own community that we felt like we needed a leader, like we couldn't live without the one person, um, in a way that made us infantilized us so that we couldn't be leaders ourselves. And I'm just wondering if that's the lesson we take from this.
I would say another of the lessons is like, um, and I think it's echoed in what Huerta said in her statement, the movement is bigger than one person, right? That maybe
Yeah.
we put too much power, too much idolatry in some of our leaders, right? That
Yeah.
maybe the danger
Yeah.
is that we don't lift up one person to this superior status. Maybe the lesson is for us to think more collectively, and to support the community of farm workers, the community of immigrants, the community of Latinos as we are under attack. Actually, I'm flying to New York tomorrow night for a journalism conference, and ICE may be in the airports I'm traveling through, and that, is a real
I'm
scary thing to think
flying out. I'm
about.
flying out of Phoenix tomorrow. ICE is here. I'm flying from Phoenix. Yeah, ICE
So,
is
like,
here.
do I carry my passport? Do I carry my ID? So this is heartbreaking news. What I do want to also just is that I think we also need time to process the grief and the pain. Um,
Mhm.
it's really hard.
For
I talked
sure.
to my students about it, and they were, uh, in pain. And luckily, I'm at a university where there are um, not a lot, but enough Latino and Chicano professors to be able to dialogue with colleagues and friends about just how painful this is. So I think we also need to give ourselves time uh, to grieve. Also to say, is David shared his experience. My mom was a farm worker. As a child, she picked cotton in Texas, and then the whole reason I wound up being born in Chicago is because of the migrant trail taking my mom's family to the Midwest, where they picked things like beets and tomatoes. And they eventually settled on a farm outside Chicago. And my mom was the youngest, and her older sisters convinced the parents that they should do factory work and not farm work. And because my mom was the youngest,
Yeah.
she's the only one that got to go to school. She's the only one that finished high school. And here I am, a college professor. So, like, that story is part of my being. And then because of my mom's experience and my parents' activism, when we grew up, like many parents, they chased that better education. So we moved out of the city and into a suburb. And we grew up, with the Chicano movement and our parents teaching us about it. So they would take my parents, two parents and five kids, one of five, we'd pile into our big car, go to our local grocery store, and we do one family picket and tell people not to buy grapes. I mean, in a
Mhm.
suburb of Chicago where they're mostly white people. So, like, they must have thought, who are these weird people? Five kids, all under the age of 18, and two adults, and we're handing out pamphlets. So this is very
Yeah.
personal to me and a lot of people who grow up with these
Yeah.
experiences, because it's
Yeah.
it's part of my cultural identity, of my political
Yeah.
identity.
Yeah. Touche. And I hated every single minute of it, Teresa, when I had to pass out those flyers because there was a lot of hostility. And I would always say, why can't we be normal like the Brady Bunch? And I remember my parents were like very, very patient, like, Mijo, you have an obligation to leave the world in a better place. Right. And that was formative because that reverberated my whole entire life, like to this very moment, those conversations and those moments. And it all came out of that movement. Right. And so you're right. Maybe this conversation is too early for some of us. Right. Because I did feel myself pushing it away and pushing it down and not like confronting it. And, I don't know that I would use the term disillusioned, but I think as John mentioned, there's just a lot of anger like this. There's just a hell of a lot of anger that went on. And then when you like connect it to, I think all of us, like it's such a personal part of our upbringing and our political and our cultural identities, maybe we need more time.
I think
Well,
for
we don't
me,
have, well, for this podcast, I wanted us
uh,
to talk about it and just,
No, I know.
I knew our thoughts weren't going to be fully formulated on every aspect of this story, but maybe talking amongst ourselves and sharing it with our viewers will spark something in someone.
And not a criticism of you, my brother, because I know we had talked about this. Juan, I wanted to hear what Juan said.
yeah, uh, yeah, for me, this does hurt. It hurts a lot. But aside from hurting about what's being reported on this whole incident, I hurt for my friends and people that have expressed how upset they are. People, who were students in the 80s and 90s who are sending me emails and posting about this and asking me, what do you think? I haven't been able to process what I think to even email them back. And I feel for friends of mine who I knew were involved in, you know, uh, creating a state holiday in a state for Cesar Chavez, renaming streets for Cesar Chavez. I think about them and I feel very sorry and bad that they're experiencing this. So it's not so much for the movement that I feel, it's for the people in the movement. So, and I'm still trying to figure out how to answer my
Yeah.
friends who are asking me about this without inflicting any more harm inadvertently.
Well, I think what I've learned, this conversation has helped inform me on some things, but I think if it's, we are all hurting, we've all lost a fallen hero, an icon, someone we could go to the library and take our kids and say, read this book about Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. But I think what Teresa said earlier reverberates. Not only believe the women, but protect the innocents. So maybe we need to center the two child victims of this, and perhaps there were more, unfortunately, that may come out, and
Yeah,
center our response on them. How do we prevent, young girls like this from being subjected to stuff like this? And maybe that's going to inform our response to this more than trying to protect the reputation of someone who had some fatal flaws. Even though it hurts us because I loved having a Cesar Chavez High School here in Phoenix, and that our City of Phoenix workers had the Cesar Chavez Day off as a paid holiday. But that doesn't mean those all have to go away, but maybe we just have to rethink them.
yeah,
I
And
Well,
mean,
I
but
think
center
that's how,
ourselves on how to protect young girls.
yeah,
yeah, absolutely. And that translates to more than just his victims have who should not be ignored, right? There should be some additional accountability. But I think it just translates like so much bigger, as I said, on the national level. Like, where's the funding? They're cutting funding for everything, right? This administration, but especially for programs to help women who are victims of violence and domestic violence. And the accountability for all the men who were involved with Epstein, of which they know who some of them are, right? In the early prosecution, I read, and maybe Professor Lopez could shed more
yeah,
light, that they chose not. There were other names. They chose not to prosecute people. We have a lot of other names of well-known figures that we've seen in the files, like whether or not they were involved in any abuse, like
yeah,
and there are the victims themselves who would testify before Congress. Like we can't let up. Like that's a very active case, and that's something that our community can support and continue to shine a light
yeah,
on.
yeah. Thank you for that. I think also that for people of our generation, I just taught the Me Too movement in class. And one thing that happens, and all of you are going to nod along with me, is that we remember the national soul searching with Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, and then it was all forgotten. And then the national soul searching with Bill Clinton, and then it was all forgotten. And then with Tarana Burke, and then the Hollywood Me Too movement, it finally felt to me, and I was already um, in my 50s, right? It felt to me like there was actually fundamental change because people in power Harvey Weinstein, Matt Lauer, Bill Cosby, like they were being held accountable. And that's something that you had just never seen before. And then you blink your eyes and that all vanished. Like they were all exonerated or they all got up on appeal. And then you have like the ugliness of Epstein Island that just sort of hangs over, I think the country as a reminder of both, oligarchy and misogyny, or the misogyny of the oligarchy, right? And I ask my students, I'm like, what happened to me too? Like, did that help? Right? Or is this just something that you have to go through every 10 or 15 years? I think for us, because we're so enmeshed, I think, with the story that, maybe as a community, we can, provide leadership in terms of how to deal with these issues kind of going forward. Right. And not forget, because it seems like every generation there's a soul searching and then we all forget and then we go through it again as some national ritual. And we don't have to do that within, I think, the Latino, I would say the Mexican American Chicano community, the folks that know the story.
And I guess that's another part for me that I'm finding highly disturbing beyond the sexual abuse, and Teresa mentioned it earlier, the treatment she received by her fellow board members of the UFW men. Um, Not only did they get caught calling her names, but the way she was treated. And apparently the article kind of outlined how she was berated on a regular basis in front of staff, in front of others. At one point, she just left. She went back to Stockton, stayed with her family for a few weeks, and then came back, I guess, to try it again. And at that point, it sounded like maybe she, Cesar, came to a realization that maybe something was going on and said, "You deserve to sit in the front with us." Pardon me, I should have had some water. And so to me, I start thinking, is this common male behavior that, was prevalent then and is prevalent now? Is this male behavior that was Ron Burgundy type stuff back in the 70s and we've come a long way? Where are we with this type of behavior when it comes to men and their treatment of their female colleagues? They're not giving credit where credit is due. We were kind of raised in that atmosphere. Really, I'm of that generation. It seems like we didn't see the last of it. I don't even know if we saw the worst of it, but it was prevalent in some of our other institutions too that I've heard that were particularly male dominated, with women trying to get some seat at the table other than doing the work, but not the strategy. So is that one of those things that you say, well, that was you can't judge them based on the times and the way things were, or is that always been out of bounds? For me, it's always been out of bounds, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen in a more prevalent manner back then.
I'll just say
How
this,
prevalent is it today?
sexism and misogyny are real today as much as they were since the beginning of time, you know, and I think we just have to acknowledge that, even post Me Too, um, if just simple representation back. So I'm in the tenure track and it's looking really positive. And if it all turns out at the end of this academic year, but I'll be the first Chicana or Latina woman in my program to get tenure. We're still having first, to be the first of this or that, 2026. So, and I have to say, like, I'm not going to get into details, but in academia, but especially in journalism, I experience sexism or racism, but I'm just going to say this without naming names. Some of the worst experiences were sexism from other Latino men. And I'm just going to say that, okay? Current and past. Um, so I just want to say that, without having to share any details. It's not the time or the place for that. But this is just the reality of
Oh,
today. It's not something from the past. It's today. And if you look at some of the voting trends, I don't have the stat in front of me, but we had a larger number of young men vote for Trump. You know, the manosphere and all this stuff, and their whole movement of wanting women not to work and just have babies. I mean, we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do.
And thankfully, women it seemed to me to be finding their way and breaking out and proving it every chance they get. And they're getting more chances to prove that they're there to actually dictate strategy and show us how to lead a company or a nonprofit or whatever. And I'm glad that's happening. But it's taken decades to let them have to get them to that foothold. And where we go from here is anybody's question. I think maybe the whole Trump saga has set a lot of different movements back. The women's movement, the Latino movement, Black movement. So we don't want to go backwards for sure. Well, this has been an interesting conversation, and I didn't know where it would go, and it's went in unexpected ways, but in positive ways. And I know I've learned a lot here, and I don't want to belabor the point. I think we've been on for a good 30 minutes or more here. So why don't I offer up some final remarks if you'd like to make them, and then we'll close this show. I will just
Well, like
say
Teresa
from
said,
the
there's a lot
outgo
of work to do.
outset here, yeah.
As I was saying, like
So I've
Teresa
been
said,
very
there's a lot of work to do, and I think that I think that I think the movement should come out stronger after this. If we sit down and work together, it's not going to go away if we just ignore it. We have to work together, and that's what the movement's always been about dignity and working together. So I think we're going to be okay, but we have to address this issue. We can't hide.
I think I'm at the point that our inability to talk about these types of issues is really a big part of the problem. Because before this happened, it happened against a template of me actually thinking of these issues a lot. I sit on the boards of both the National Women's Law Center and the Equal Rights Advocate. So I sit on one of the few men on two boards. And during the board meeting, there was a lot of talk about the neonatalist movement and trad wives and all of this other stuff that maybe a lot of us don't know, right? That I don't really know. I learn about stuff like that from my students, but that's a big part of our society. And this happened, I think, against a template of me like reading a lot about the evangelical movement and just how powerful it's become politically and just how it's ingrained with both issues of gender and race. And and then you have this HBO documentary on the manosphere, which came out at the same time. So you can say, hey, wait a second, 55% of the law students entering law school now are women. Like our dean is a woman, our vice dean is a woman, but what happens in that space is they have this sort of like virulent backlash or blowback where, oh, we need to rescue old fashioned masculinity. And you have these basically assholes that go on with millions of followers and like, women want to be led around by their hair, basically is what they're saying. Right. And that has gained traction. Right. So it's sort of like, so what happens is I think in this fragmented social media environment, I can't tell if we're moving backwards or forwards half the time. Right. Because sometimes it feels like I look at my class, I'm like, well, okay, the majority are women. And then you see this other stuff that's going on and often beyond, the confines of Arizona State University Law School or my own circles, like, and then you see this stuff going on in the country and you're like, hey, we might not be all right. Right. Epstein Island is still a rich issue and a lot of people just don't really give a shit. And you start to hear see the normalization of like, well, Laura Ingraham, like, well, they were 17. They were like, it's not, they were 13, you start to see like the slow encroachment. And it feels like we're not going in the right direction. And I'm just wondering if the only way we address this is like putting these issues on the table, right? And just having the conversations in as many mixed spaces as possible. Just because I think it's hard to assess where we are in the current moment, but it does feel like we're moving in two different directions, right? And even if you have, 55% in the law firms, the C-suite is all men still, right? So that becomes a little bit of an illusion. And I just think we need to have these conversations. But I think because gender and race interact so often, I think for our community to have these conversations, if we can use this incident, like this is the most unimaginably horrid scenario for us to confront this, right? Is for like, one of the central icons, if not the central icon of our community, maybe this is an opportunity for us to have those conversations, as hard as it is. And that means confront the people who are like, oh, they set them up, or why did the press press come out with it now? All that stuff. Right. I just think we have to have a conversation. We could lead
Yeah, I
Similar
agree.
to a truth and reconciliation.
Yeah, I
truth
mean,
and
I agree. Once
reconciliation.
we get past the anger and grief, we need to focus on healing. Um,
Yeah.
it's triggering for women who've experienced harassment, abuse, and worse. Um, but I also want to just say it's accountability from men and women. You know, when uh when Trump was elected the first time, I mean, it was so clear to me. Obviously, he started his campaign attacking Mexicans and also women, calling women journalists names so many times. And where were the
Still.
men and still, and where were the other journalists speaking up for there's no room for abuse, right? And so also just to point out, at least a majority of white women voted for him,
Yeah.
and a man who said it's okay to grab him by the pee. The fact that this is the reality is just still mind-boggling to me. I will say, overwhelming majority of Black women, something 95% didn't voted against him. And a majority of Latinas, although not as many as Black women, also voted against him. But part of the problem, when I looked at like women have in a huge many states, I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, have lost bodily autonomy, you know? And I remember having a conversation leading up to the next election with a man of color about why I had to vote for Harris, even though there's a lot of things I didn't like about her, because I have to protect a woman's right to choose. Because that is tied to everything. That is tied to job, insurance, health, so many things. If a woman can't choose whether she wants to have a baby or not, that affects everything. Um, and this man of color said to me, well, she can go to another state. I'm like, with what money? But and so that's part of the problem. And so I thought, oh, well, women are just going to vote against him. But women of color did, but not white women. And so it's not just an issue of, men owning their behavior, but looking at this deep-seated misogyny that is real
Yeah.
today. We need
Yeah.
to talk.
But I think the other thing is that the number of Latino men and Black men who voted for him also increased, right? And so we did have this sort of like gendered, I'm a real man, I understand you kind of appeal that we fell into, that Black men fell into as well. And I just think it's really important to kind of get to the nub of that. There had been long talk of a crisis for Black men in the Black community because of the education gap, and then you saw it with the Latino community. Now you see it with the white community as well. And so, no doubt that's connected by this like state of whatever insecurity that Trump has taken advantage of, right? The sort of male insecurity is taken advantage of. So these misogynistic appeals work. I'm like surprised they work. I watch this shit. I'm like, how do they work? But then I'm someone, who has a degree. I'm someone, whatever. I'm not in that space, right? And so it's hard to it's hard to understand how those appeals might work, but they are working in our community, right? Um, One of my students pointed out the other day, and they do reflections because otherwise they won't talk. And he's like, the suicide rate for white men is 3 times the rate of any other group. I'm like, I did not know that, right? And then you start looking at it, and it's concentrated in rural communities, and it's concentrated in economically precarious communities. And you know who knows that? Donald Trump. And that's what that's the heart of a cynical appeal, because, well, he's sort of appealing to them through misogyny, through not so subtle dog whistles. He's reaping the benefits of it. He's unaccountable because of Epstein Island. Like, he's part of the oligarchy. He's untouchable, right? And I just think we need to like really dig down and deal with those issues, and they confront our community. It's not These divides between the communities aren't that sharp. And we all know a lot of men a lot of Latino men who kind of fell for that, and for the same reasons. And so this is an opportunity for us to address that.
Yeah, I think holding our own community accountable, the Latino men who still are openly sexist. And you make a good point about education. I think it's also values and also maybe religion too, because there are plenty of educated people who voted for him, people with college degrees too. So I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that it's just the only like possible hopeful thing is that we're talking about it, right? That we're talking about it, and that is a good thing. That we're talking about misogyny and and how our own community is clearly guilty of that, and that so we need to talk to people. We need to talk to our friends, our colleague, our family members, our students, young people. We just need to
And
try and seek some sense of accountability and really talk about this because it's not just in the past. My fear is that people think, "Oh, this happened a long time ago. It's in the past." It's not. It's ever present today. It's present in who gets promoted and um who gets resources, who gets elected. It's present. And so I think the best thing we can do is continue these conversations and vote.
with that, I would like to end this show by saying thank you to all my guests. You've really illuminated these issues and given us more fodder, more things to think about more deeply, and hopefully more openly. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for watching this episode of ImpactoAZ, and please subscribe. We'd like to continue giving you content like this, and your subscription would go a long way in helping us get there. So with that, thank you today, gentlemen and Teresa, and we hope to have you back on the show soon. Take care.